The C-17 Globemaster shuddered through turbulence somewhere over the Hindu Kush, its cargo bay filled with enough firepower to level a compound and enough testosterone to fuel a small war. 73 Navy SEALs sat strapped into red webbing seats, their gear rattling with each pocket of unstable air. They were returning from a classified operation that had gone textbook perfect, the kind of mission that would never make the news but would live forever in the silent nods exchanged in Virginia Beach bars. The mood was loose, celebratory even, with the kind of dark humor that only comes after surviving something that could have gone catastrophically wrong. In the far corner of the cargo bay, hunched against the cold aluminum skin of the aircraft, sat a figure that didn't belong. A woman, maybe 40, maybe 50, wearing clothes that had seen better decades. Her jacket was military surplus, the kind you find in thrift stores 3 states away from any base, faded and oil-stained. Her boots were held together with duct tape. A canvas bag served as her pillow, and she was asleep, or appeared to be, her face turned toward the wall, breath steady despite the engine roar that made conversation nearly impossible without shouting. The SEALs had noticed her when they boarded in Bagram. She'd been there already, tucked into that corner like cargo someone forgot to manifest. A few had exchanged glances, the universal military expression that asked without words, "Who the hell is that?" The loadmaster had waved off questions with bureaucratic indifference. "Space-available flight," he'd said. "Humanitarian transport. Happens all the time." The SEALs had shrugged and moved on. They had bigger things to think about than one homeless woman catching a ride back to civilization. But an hour into the flight, after the adrenaline had worn off and the reality of the long journey home settled in, boredom made people observant. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, a man whose shoulders seemed engineered specifically for carrying responsibility, noticed her first in a meaningful way. Not the fact of her presence, which he'd clocked immediately, but something else. Something in the way she slept, even in that corner, even in those clothes. There was a stillness to her that wasn't quite civilian. A quality he'd seen before in people who'd learned to sleep anywhere, through anything, because they'd had to. He nudged the operator next to him, a sniper named Ortega who could spot a rabbit at 800 meters. "That woman," Webb said, his voice just loud enough to cut through the engine drone. "You notice anything off?" Ortega followed Webb's gaze, studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Homeless, probably. Mental health issues. You know how it is." Webb wasn't so sure. The conversation rippled outward through the cargo bay like a slow-motion shockwave. Within minutes, half the team was stealing glances at the sleeping woman, each adding their own theory to the growing speculation. Some thought she was a contractor, burned out and broken. Others figured she was military adjacent, maybe a supply clerk who'd fallen through the cracks of the VA system. A few made crueler assumptions, the kind that came easy when you were tired and still running on combat chemicals. But no one knew. And in a community where knowing everything about everyone was part of the survival calculus, the not knowing became an itch that needed scratching. The aircraft hit another patch of rough air, and this time the woman stirred, just slightly. Her hand moved from inside her jacket to rest on her bag, a movement so subtle most missed it. But Webb saw. He saw because he'd made that exact motion 10,000 times himself, the unconscious verification that your weapon was still there, still within reach. Except she didn't have a weapon. At least, not one anyone could see. "Hey," someone called out, one of the younger SEALs, a kid named Pacheco who hadn't yet learned that some questions were better left unasked. "You awake over there?" The woman didn't respond. The cargo bay fell into an awkward silence, the kind where everyone suddenly became very interested in their own gear. But Pacheco, emboldened by youth and audience, tried again. "I'm talking to you, ma'am. You awake?" This time she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head away from the wall. Her eyes opened, and they were the color of winter sky over water, pale gray and impossibly alert. Not the eyes of someone who'd just been sleeping. The eyes of someone who'd been listening to every word, tracking every movement, assessing threat levels while pretending to be unconscious. The eyes of someone who'd done this before. She looked at Pashiko, then past him, taking in the entire cargo bay in one sweep. Her gaze lingered on Webb for a fraction of a second longer than the others, some kind of recognition passing between them that neither acknowledged. Then she spoke, her voice rough from disuse but carrying clearly over the engine noise. "I'm awake." 2 words, that was all, but something in the way she said them made Pashiko sit back in his seat. Webb leaned forward slightly, his interest now fully engaged. "You military?" he asked, cutting through whatever Pashiko had been about to say next. The woman's expression didn't change. "Was." "What branch?" "Air Force." A ripple of barely suppressed laughter ran through the SEALs. Chair Force, as they called it, the branch most associated with air conditioning and 3 hot meals. The easy service, the safe one. One of the team members, a beefy operator named Tors, couldn't resist. "Let me guess. Finance, personnel, you push papers at some desk in Colorado Springs." The woman turned her gaze to Tors, studied him with the same intensity she'd given the rest of the cargo bay. When she spoke, her voice carried no defensiveness, no anger, just flat statement. "No." "So what then?" Tors pressed, grinning now, playing to his audience. "You a crew chief, load cargo like our boy up front, that's pretty physical work, respect." She didn't take the out he was offering. "No." The grin faded slightly from Tors' face. "Then what?" For a long moment the woman said nothing. The C-17's engines filled the silence, a constant roar that somehow made the quiet between words feel heavier. Then, without ceremony, she said, "I flew." The reaction was immediate. More laughter, louder this time. Flying meant different things to different people, and in the minds of most SEALs, Air Force pilots were glorified bus drivers. They flew cargo planes from base to base, logging hours in safe airspace, pulling down good pay and even better benefits before retiring to comfortable civilian jobs. They weren't operators. They weren't door kickers. They were support, necessary but distant, disconnected from the real war. "Oh, you flew," Tors said, his voice dripping with theatrical admiration. "Well, that changes everything. What you fly? C-130s, KC-135 tankers. Let me guess, you did the milk run between Germany and Kuwait, hauling supplies, watching movies in the cockpit, living that sweet deployed life with actual beds and internet." The woman's expression still hadn't changed, that same neutral mask giving nothing away. "No." Tors spread his hands, inviting her to elaborate, making a show of it. "Then what? Come on, don't leave us hanging. What you fly?" She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said very simply, "A-10." The laughter died. Not all at once, but quickly enough that its absence became noticeable. Because even SEALs, even Tier 1 operators who considered themselves the apex predators of the military food chain, knew what an A-10 pilot was. They'd called in close air support enough times, had lain in dirt, and listened to the distinctive sound of that GAU-8 Avenger cannon turning enemy positions into pink mist. They knew that A-10 pilots flew low, slow, and ugly, deliberately putting themselves in the engagement zone. They knew the aircraft was built around a gun that fired depleted uranium rounds the size of Coke bottles. They knew that Warthog drivers had a reputation for being slightly unhinged, the kind of crazy that made them fly into situations that faster, sleeker jets would avoid. Webb sat up straighter. "A-10," he repeated, and this time there was no mockery in his voice. "How long?" 16 years. "Combat deployments." She tilted her head slightly, and for the first time, something that might have been amusement touched her eyes. "How many you got?" The question hung there, a gentle challenge. Webb had 7 combat deployments, which was exceptional even by SEAL standards. He didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. "I did 12, she said. "Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, some other places we weren't supposed to be." The cargo bay had gone completely quiet now except for the engines. Every SEAL was listening, the casual boredom of the long flight replaced by something else. Interest, maybe respect, definitely curiosity. Ortega the sniper spoke up, "What's your name?" The woman hesitated, just for a second but long enough that Webb noticed. When she answered, it came out reluctantly, like she was offering up something she'd gotten used to keeping hidden. "Callas, Evelyn Callas." "Callas," Webb repeated, testing the name. "Don't suppose you had a call sign?" Again that hesitation, then quieter, "Reaper." Torres let out a low whistle. "Reaper, that's not a call sign you get for being mediocre." For the first time, Callas's expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, but a shadow of something that might have been one once. "No," she agreed. "It's not." Webb leaned back against the cargo netting, his mind working. A-10 pilot, 12 deployments, call sign like that. And now she was sleeping in a corner of a C-17, wearing clothes held together with hope and tape. The math didn't add up, and when things didn't add up, Webb's instincts said there was a story worth hearing. "Reaper," he said, emphasizing the word slightly, giving it weight. "I want to hear how you earned that." Callas looked at him, and in that look, Webb saw something he recognized. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was the kind that came from carrying things too heavy for too long, the kind that seeped into your bones and made you wonder why you bothered getting up in the morning. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough. "You don't want to hear that story," Callas said, and her voice carried a finality that suggested the conversation was over. But Torres, never good at reading rooms, pushed forward. "Come on, ma'am. We just spent 3 days in hell and came back clean. We could use a good war story. What's the worst thing that happened up there in your jet? You take some small arms fire, have to divert to a different base because of weather." The mockery was back in his voice, gentle but present, the kind that suggested he still didn't quite believe that anything a pilot experienced could compare to what ground forces went through. And maybe he was right in some ways. Different wars, different perspectives. But Webb was watching Callas's face, and he saw the shutters come down, saw the wall go up. She turned back toward the cargo bay wall, her body language clearly signaling the end of the discussion. "I'm going back to sleep," she said. "We've still got 8 hours of flight time." Torres started to say something else, but Webb cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Let it go." Not everyone wanted to share their demons with a cargo bay full of strangers, no matter how much those strangers thought they understood. Webb got that. He respected it. Whatever Callas had seen, whatever had reduced an A-10 pilot with 12 combat deployments to sleeping in corners of military aircraft, that was her business. The conversation fragmented after that, breaking into smaller clusters of quiet discussion. But Webb noticed that eyes kept drifting back to Callas and the tone had shifted. The easy mockery was gone, replaced by something more cautious, more thoughtful, because call signs like Reaper meant something. They weren't given lightly. And the fact that this woman, this person they'd initially dismissed as just another casualty of a system that chewed up veterans and spat them out, had earned that name meant she'd done things, seen things, survived things. Webb had a rule, one he'd developed over 15 years in special operations. Never underestimate quiet people. The ones who talked the loudest usually had the least to say. The ones who stayed silent, who kept their stories locked away, those were the ones who'd actually been through it. Those were the ones who knew that some experiences didn't translate into words, couldn't be packaged into neat anecdotes for entertainment. An hour passed, then 2. The cargo bay settled into the peculiar rhythm of military transport, that combination of boredom and discomfort that made time feel both endless and irrelevant. Some SEALs slept. Others played cards on makeshift tables made from equipment cases. A few cleaned weapons that didn't need cleaning, the kind of busy work that kept hands occupied and minds from wandering too far into dark places. Callas remained motionless against the wall, and this time Webb thought she might actually be sleeping, until the C-17 hit another patch of turbulence, worse than before, the kind that made loose gear rattle and stomachs drop. The kind that, for just a moment, reminded everyone that they were 7 miles above hostile territory in a metal tube held aloft by physics and prayer. Callas's eyes snapped open before anyone else even registered the change in flight dynamics. Her hand went to that same spot inside her jacket, that same unconscious check for weapons that weren't there. And Webb saw her scan the cargo bay, saw her count heads, assess structural integrity, calculate angles and options with a speed that spoke to thousands of hours of training. Then, just as quickly, she forced herself to relax, to settle back against the wall, to let her hand fall away. But the mask had slipped, just for a second, but long enough for Webb to see what was underneath. Fear. Not the normal kind, the kind that came from turbulence and uncertainty. Something deeper. Something that had roots going down into dark places where reason didn't reach. Post-traumatic stress. Webb had seen it before, in teammates, in himself during the bad stretches. The way certain sounds or situations could trigger responses that logic couldn't control. The way your body remembered danger even when your mind knew you were safe. Callas had it bad, he could tell. The kind of bad that came from experiencing something so far outside the normal human experience that your nervous system couldn't calibrate back to baseline. The turbulence passed. The C-17 smoothed out. Callas closed her eyes again, but Webb noticed her breathing had changed, slightly faster, slightly shallower. She was awake, fighting something inside her head, trying to maintain that appearance of calm control. He wanted to say something, to reach out in the way that combat veterans sometimes could, that unspoken recognition of shared experience. But before he could find the words, Pacheco, who apparently had no internal filter whatsoever, spoke up again from across the cargo bay. "Hey, Reaper," Pacheco called out, using her call sign with a familiarity that hadn't been earned. "If you're really an A-10 pilot, prove it. Tell us something only someone who flew combat would know." Webb shot Pacheco a look that promised future pain, but the damage was done. The question hung in the air, and now others were turning to look curious despite themselves. Because Pacheco, annoying as he was, had vocalized what several of them were thinking. Talk was cheap. Call signs could be claimed. Anyone could say they'd done things. But operators had ways of verifying, of testing, of separating the real from the fraudulent. Callas opened her eyes again. This time when she looked at Pacheco, there was no neutrality in her expression, just exhaustion and maybe a trace of anger. "You want proof?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying clearly. "Yeah," Pacheco said, too young to recognize the warning signs. "Yeah, I do." Callas was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her jacket, that same pocket she kept checking, and pulled something out. She held it up, and even from across the cargo bay, Webb could see what it was. A patch. Faded, worn, the kind that had been Velcroed to flight suits 1,000 times. The kind that carried unit insignia and personal markings. She tossed it across the cargo bay. It sailed through the air, end over end, and landed perfectly in Pacheco's lap with a soft thump. He picked it up, studied it, and his expression changed. 23rd Fighter Group, he read aloud. Flying Tigers and this other one. He turned the patch over, examining the back. "What's this symbol?" "Skull with wings," Callas said from across the bay. 37 kill markings underneath. Each one represents a confirmed vehicle, structure, or enemy position destroyed in combat. That's just from my last deployment. I have others. The cargo bay went dead silent. 37 confirmed kills in a single deployment was extraordinary. Most pilots flew entire careers without seeing that kind of action. It meant she'd been in thick of it, repeatedly, flying mission after mission into situations that most would avoid. It meant every word she'd said was true, and probably understated. Torres reached over and took the patch from Pacheco, examined it himself. When he looked back at Callas, the mockery was completely gone from his face. 37, he said, and it wasn't a question, just acknowledgement, respect. Callas nodded once. 37 that I could confirm, probably more. When you're firing 70 rounds per second into a target area, exact body counts get difficult. Webb felt a chill run down his spine, because he'd been on the ground when A-10s made runs like that. He'd seen what 70 rounds per second of 30 depleted uranium did to human beings, to vehicles, to fortified positions. It wasn't clean. It wasn't surgical. It was apocalyptic, biblical, the kind of violence that rewrote terrain and turned organized military forces into organic debris. And this woman, this person sitting in torn clothes in the corner of a cargo bay, had delivered that violence 36 times in a single deployment. "Jesus," someone whispered. Callas stood up, slowly, carefully, and walked across the cargo bay to retrieve her patch. The movement was slightly stiff, like standing hurt, like her body was operating on borrowed time. She took the patch from Torres without meeting his eyes, returned to her corner, tucked it back into her jacket, and sat down. No one spoke for a long time after that. The reality of who they were sharing space with had shifted the dynamic completely. This wasn't some broken veteran who'd washed out of an easy job. This was someone who'd been in the fight repeatedly, at a level most of them could only imagine. Someone who'd dealt death from the sky and lived with the weight of that for over a decade. Webb found his voice first. "Reaper," he said, and this time the call sign came out differently with the weight it deserved. "How'd you end up here, I mean?" He gestured vaguely at her clothes, at the situation. "What happened?" It was a personal question, maybe too personal, but something about the moment felt like it demanded honesty. Like the old rules about privacy and boundaries had been suspended by mutual recognition of shared experience. Callas looked at him for a long time before answering. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, emotionless, the kind of tone that came from telling a story you'd told yourself too many times in the dark hours of the night. "I flew my last mission on October 7th, 2023, she said. Helmand Province. Support for a Marine unit that had gotten pinned down by Taliban fighters in a compound. Standard close air support, except it wasn't standard. Intel was wrong. The Marines weren't the only people in that compound." She paused, and Webb saw her hands tighten slightly, bunching the fabric of her jacket. There were civilians, 23 of them. Women and children mostly, being used as human shields by the Taliban fighters, but we didn't know that until after. The cargo bay was so quiet now that the engine noise seemed distant, muted, like the universe was holding its breath. Because everyone there understood what was coming next. They'd all heard variations of this story, had nightmares about being in situations exactly like this one, where the line between heroism and horror was determined by information you didn't have. "I made the run," Callas continued, her voice never wavering, never changing in pitch or volume, just steady recitation of facts that had probably been reviewed 10,000 times in official reports and her own tortured memory. 78 depleted uranium rounds into the target structure. The Marines were saved. The Taliban fighters were eliminated, and 23 civilians died in approximately 4.3 seconds. Someone in the cargo bay made a sound, quickly suppressed. Webb felt his chest tighten. 4.3 seconds. The clinical precision of that number, the way she'd clearly memorized exactly how long it took to kill innocent people, that said everything about how much she'd replayed that moment. "Investigation cleared me," Callas said. "Rules of engagement were followed. Intel was bad, not my fault. Marines vouched for me, said I saved their lives, which was true, but none of that changed what happened. None of that brought back those kids." She finally looked up, meeting Webb's eyes directly, and he saw something in her gaze that made his blood run cold. Not madness exactly, but something close. The look of someone who'd seen hell and couldn't find the way back. "I finished out my contract," she said. 3 more months. Every time I got in the cockpit, I saw those compounds. Every time I pulled the trigger, I heard those estimated casualties. They offered me a promotion, asked me to stay. I declined, got out, tried civilian life, tried therapy, tried pills, tried drinking. None of it worked. So you ended up here, Webb said quietly. So I ended up here, Callas agreed, sleeping in corners, catching space-safe flights when I can, moving, because if I keep moving, maybe the ghosts can't keep up. The silence that followed her words was crushing. Every person in that cargo bay carried their own ghosts, their own bad calls, their own moments where everything went wrong despite doing everything right. But there was something about Callas's story, about the sheer randomness of the horror, that hit differently. Because she hadn't made a mistake. She'd done everything correctly, and 23 people had died anyway. Tors, who'd started this conversation with mockery, spoke up. His voice was rough, stripped of all pretense. That wasn't your fault. You know that, right? That was war. That was the job. You saved your guys. Callas looked at him, and for the first time, emotion cracked through her voice. I know that in my head, but my head isn't the part that wakes up screaming at 3 a.m. My head isn't the part that sees their faces in every crowd, every group of kids, every family photo on every fucking wall in every building I pass. She stood up again, this time more abruptly, and walked to the small porthole window in the cargo bay. She pressed her face against it, looking out at the empty sky, the vast nothing that stretched in all directions. I was good at my job, she said, speaking more to the window than to the seals behind her. Really good. Maybe the best in my squadron, and that's the worst part. Because if I'd been worse, if I'd hesitated, if I'd questioned the intel, maybe those Marines would have died instead. But maybe those kids would have lived. And I don't know which choice would have been right. I don't know if there was a right choice. I just know I pull that trigger every single night in my dreams, and every single time those civilians die, and every single time, I wake up wondering why I'm still breathing when they're not. Webb had no response to that. None of them did, because she was right. There were some situations where there were no good choices, only less terrible ones, and the people forced to make those choices carried them forever. No amount of therapy, no number of it wasn't your fault speeches, no official clearances or commendations could change the weight of taking innocent lives, even accidentally, even with the best intentions. Ortega broke the silence, his voice careful. You have family, anyone supporting you. Callas laughed, but there was no humor in it. Had a husband, divorced 2 months after I got out, said he couldn't watch me destroy myself, said I'd changed. He wasn't wrong. Kids? No, thank God. At least I spared them this. Where are you headed? Webb asked. What's the plan when we land? Callas turned back from the window and her expression had closed off again, that mask sliding back into place. Don't know. Wherever, doesn't matter. One base is the same as another. One shelter is the same as the next. You keep moving, you keep breathing, and maybe eventually something changes. Or it doesn't. Either way, the sun comes up and you do it again. The resignation in her voice was worse than anger would have been, because it meant she'd given up. Not on living exactly, but on the idea that living might ever feel like something other than punishment. The conversation died after that. No one knew what to say. They'd come into this flight fresh off a successful mission, riding high on accomplishment and survival. And now they were sitting in silence, confronted with the reality that sometimes success cost more than failure, that sometimes coming home was harder than dying, that the enemy wasn't always the one shooting back. Webb watched Callas settle back into her corner, watched her close her eyes and force her breathing into the slow rhythm of sleep. But he knew she wasn't sleeping, knew she was just removing herself from a situation that had become too painful, too exposing. And he respected that, even as he wished there was something he could do. The hours crawled by. Somewhere over the Atlantic, as the sun started to paint the horizon in shades of amber and crimson, Pacheco spoke up again. This time his voice was different, subdued, thoughtful. Hey, Reaper, he said quietly. I'm sorry for earlier, for pushing, for not understanding. Callas didn't open her eyes. It's fine. It's not fine, Pacheco insisted. You earned that call sign, you earned respect, and I didn't give it, I'm sorry." This time Callas did open her eyes. She looked at Pacheco, really looked at him, and some of the hardness softened. "You're young," she said. "You still think war is glory. Give it time. It'll teach you different." "I hope not," Pacheco said quietly. "I hope I never have to learn that particular lesson." "Yeah," Callas said, closing her eyes again. "Me too." The C-17 began its descent into Dover Air Force Base as dawn broke fully over Delaware. The loadmaster called out 30 minutes to landing, and the SEALs began the familiar ritual of preparing gear, checking equipment, transforming back from weary travelers into the professional operators they needed to be on the ground. Webb stood, stretched muscles that had gone stiff during the long flight, and made his way across the cargo bay to where Callas sat. He crouched down next to her, close enough to talk without shouting over the engine noise. She opened her eyes, regarded him with that same wary exhaustion. "I don't know what you need," Webb said carefully. "I don't know what would help or if anything can help, but I know people, VA people, advocate groups, other pilots who have been through similar stuff. If you want contact information, I can get it for you." Callas studied him for a long moment. "You think that would make a difference?" "I don't know," Webb admitted, "but I know that giving up makes no difference at all, and you're not gone yet. You're still here, still moving, still trying. That counts for something." "Does it?" "It does to those Marines you saved. It does to every person who's still alive because you were good at your job. You saved lives, Reaper. A lot of them. More than you took, I'd bet." "You don't know that," Callas said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "No," Webb agreed. "But I know operators. I know what we do, what we're asked to do, and what it costs. And I know that the ones who care, who feel it, who carry it, those are the good ones. The ones who don't feel anything, those are the ones we should worry about. You feel everything, which means you're exactly the kind of person who should have been flying that jet, because you never took it lightly. You never treated it like a game." Callas's eyes glistened just slightly before she blinked and looked away. "That's nice of you to say." "It's true," Webb said. He pulled out a small notebook, scribbled something quickly, tore out the page, and handed it to her. "My contact information. I can't promise I'll have answers, but if you need someone who understands, someone who's been in dark places and found their way out, call me. Or don't. Your choice. But you're not as alone as you think you are." Callas took the paper, folded it carefully, tucked it into her jacket next to that worn patch. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I mean it." Webb nodded, stood, returned to his gear. The C-17's wheels touched down with a jolt, the screech of rubber on runway marking the end of their journey. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, Webb glanced back one more time at Callas. She was standing now, shouldering her small canvas bag, preparing to disappear back into whatever life she'd constructed from the wreckage of her old one. The cargo ramp lowered, and bright morning light flooded the bay. The SEALs filed out in practiced formation, boots hitting tarmac, immediately transitioning into mission debrief mode. Webb lingered, watching as Callas descended the ramp more slowly, squinting against the sunlight like someone unused to its warmth. She paused at the bottom of the ramp, turned back, found Webb in the crowd. For just a moment she straightened her shoulders, pulled them back in something close to a military bearing, and gave him a small nod. Recognition, acknowledgement, maybe even the faintest hint of hope. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the controlled chaos of the flight line. Just another figure among many, unremarkable and unnoticed, except by those who knew to look closer. Torres appeared at Webb's shoulder. "Think she'll call?" "I don't know," Webb said. "I hope so." "That was heavy," Torres said quietly. "That story, those numbers." "Yeah. Makes you think, doesn't it? About what we do, about what it costs." Webb turned to look at Torres, saw the reflection of his own thoughts in the man's expression. "Every day," he said. "Every single day." They stood there for a moment longer, two operators among many, watching the normal operations of a military base going through its normal routine. unloading cargo, refueling aircraft, personnel moving from one assignment to the next, the machinery of war grinding forward, indifferent to individual suffering, focused only on the mission. But somewhere in that crowd, a woman who'd given 16 years of her life to service, who'd saved countless lives at the cost of her own peace, was walking alone. And that felt wrong to Webb, felt like a failure of the system that had trained her, used her, and then discarded her when the weight became too much to carry. "We need to do better," Webb said, more to himself than to Tors. "As a community, as a military, as a country, we need to do better by people like her." "Agreed," Tors said, "but how?" "I don't know, but we start by remembering their names, by telling their stories, by making sure that when someone like Callas falls through the cracks, enough people notice to pull them back out." The rest of the team had dispersed by now, heading to debriefs and transport and the long process of reintegrating into whatever passed for normal life. Webb and Tors followed, leaving the flight line behind. But Webb kept that image in his mind. Callas, straightening her shoulders, finding dignity in the wreckage. Because that moment mattered. That moment meant she wasn't finished yet. And as long as she wasn't finished, there was hope. 3 days later, Webb's phone rang at 11 p.m. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Webb," his voice was cautious. "This is Callas." Pause. "You said to call if I needed someone who understood." Webb sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "I did, and I meant it. You okay?" "No," she said simply, "but I'm still here, and I'm tired of being alone in this." "Where are you?" She gave him an address, a VA clinic in Baltimore. Webb checked his watch, calculated distance. "I can be there in 90 minutes, he said. "You don't have to do that." "I know, I'm coming anyway. Put some coffee on." A long pause, then very quietly, "Thank you." "No," Webb said. "Thank you for calling, for trusting me, for still being here." He hung up, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. Because this was what brotherhood meant. Not the missions, not the glory, not the stories told in bars. This. The 3 a.m. phone calls. The drives through the night. The sitting in silence with someone who needed to know they weren't alone. This was the real measure of honor, and Webb would be damned if he'd fail it. As he drove through the dark Virginia countryside toward Baltimore, Webb thought about call signs and their meanings. Reaper. She'd earned it delivering death from above, precise and devastating. But maybe it meant something else too. Maybe it meant she was still reaping the consequences of every decision, every mission, every trigger pull. Maybe it meant she was harvesting ghosts. But maybe, just maybe, with enough support and enough time, that call sign could mean something different. Maybe it could mean she'd reaped wisdom from experience, reaped strength from survival, reaped the right to still be here despite everything trying to drag her down. He didn't know, but he was willing to find out. And as the highway stretched before him, empty and dark except for his headlights cutting through the night, Webb made a promise to himself and to Callas. He wouldn't let her face those reaped ghosts alone. The story of Reaper wasn't over yet. It was just changing chapters. And maybe this next one would be about reclamation, about taking back pieces of yourself that war had stolen, about finding purpose in helping others navigate the same darkness you'd survived. Maybe, just maybe. Because in the end, hope was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition. And as long as people like Callas kept picking up,